Hello, Church of the River family, and welcome back to our series that is all about Jesus. We have been examining Jesus' life and ministry from the Gospel of Mark. So far, we've seen the forerunner, we've seen his message, and now we are going to see up close and personal Peter's telling of Jesus' ministry. And what you're going to see here is that Peter kind of feels like he's being launched out of a cannon into this ministry. Like he's being overwhelmed by the things that just keep coming faster than he can take them in. And we believe this because it keeps saying immediately, and then immediately, and then immediately, and then immediately, and then boom, and then boom, and then whoa, and then I was like this, and then what do I make of this? And you can feel that Peter is just on this roller coaster of remembering all that was happening in the early days of him ministering alongside Jesus Christ. You can see that Jesus' ministry to Peter was an overwhelming sensation of one hit after another amazing thing, after another thing that left him stupefied. And we see that in the writing of Mark. And so my hope is that as we dive into this whirlwind story, we bring a little bit of clarity. Hopefully you've taken the time to read through Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 39. But if you haven't done that, I encourage you right now to pause and to make sure that you read through this section of Scripture, and maybe read through it again in order to make sure that you're catching the story that we're gonna dig through today. That's Mark chapter 1, verse 21 through 39. All right, let's dive into this, because in this we see some key components of what Jesus' ministry was all about. The very first thing you're going to see in verses 21 through 28 is that Jesus was a teacher. And the first observation we see about him as a teacher comes in verse 21. And we see here that Jesus wasn't just any other teacher. Jesus was assuming authority in the place where people were taught. We see him walking right into a synagogue. A synagogue was kind of like a Jewish church back in the day. It was a place where the people gathered. On the holy day, they would open up the Word, they would read the Word, someone would explain the Word. Throughout the week, it was a school, and it was the place where you'd come in order to get judgments by the elders of the people. And ultimately, it was like the center of the town. And Jesus walks right into the center of this community, really, of the Jewish people, and he walks in and he acts like he owns the place. I mean, maybe it was right after there was the reading of the day from the elder that was in charge, but ultimately Jesus grabs the mic. And Jesus, as this out-of-town, new upstart rabbi, assumes that he can just take the stage and start teaching the word. Now, I know that maybe Jesus had some rumors already going around about him that came out of Judea, and maybe some of the people actually knew that Jesus had a right to teach in this way. But I want you to put yourself there as just a commonplace person that's sitting in the synagogue like you do every single Sunday. Think of a person walking into your hometown church that you grew up in. They're going through the motions. You know that so-and-so is going to get up and read. You know that so-and-so is going to crack a joke. You know all these normals, all these comfortable things that you are experiencing week in and week out at this location. But then comes this upstart rabbi, and he grabs the mic, and he starts saying things that aren't just controversial, but if they're true, they change everything. He starts to assume that he can talk, and he can talk with a tremendous amount of authority. What would you have been thinking? What have you been feeling? This leads me to ask you a more personal question. Would you be okay if Jesus, so to speak, grabbed the mic in your comfort zone and started telling you truths that were uncomfortable? Well, the story continues in verse 22. We see that Jesus isn't just teaching like everybody else, but Jesus is teaching with a sense of convicting authority. He isn't mixing words. You see, back in this time, it was very commonplace for a teacher to get up and say, "Oh, Rabbi so-and-so thinks this, and Rabbi so-and-so thinks this, and oh, this scribe taught this, and this scribe taught this." And it was more of a lecture and a discussion of different opinions on the Old Testament text. But Jesus steps into that culture, into that norm, and starts to declare truths that are cutting through the crowd like a hot knife cuts through butter. He says, you've heard it this way, but this is the truth. This is a lie, and this is truth. He makes things that were gray into black and white for the people, and the people's minds are being blown. Literally, it says this, that they were astonished. This word means to be amazed at, or to be shocked by, or even to be struck by what he is saying. I mean, people aren't leaning in at this point. They're leaning back. And they're like, whoa, what is he saying? And you would be too. Think about this. Put yourself there. We've all heard the debates of Calvinism versus Arminianism. Imagine he just comes in and says, hey, you're both wrong. This is the way it is. There'd be people on either side startled by this information. Imagine you'd grown up your whole life as a good Catholic going to Mass at the same church, and then Jesus shows up at Mass, and he upends your entire life's traditions. He starts saying that that's wrong, and this is the way you ought to walk. This would be shocking information. And make no mistakes, Jesus' words would have rattled you too. Those straight truths would have struck at your core. And ultimately would have been plucking your strings on that day. This leads me to a question. Do Jesus' words have a right to correct your truth? Does Jesus have an audience with you to define what truth is and to correct those things that you hold to as your truth? Let's keep reading. We see in verses 23 through 28, all right, that Jesus has now finished this little episode in the synagogue, and now he's going to his mother-in-law's, to Peter's mother-in-law's place. And the first thing that we see here is that Jesus heals the hostess, Peter's mother-in-law. This is frankly always a smart move. Have your mother-in-law healed by your buddy. He may be a fisherman, but he isn't dumb, all right? He didn't miss this opportunity. Ultimately, though, I think Peter did need this one, and Jesus is maybe doing something to have Peter's back. You got to think of it from a mother-in-law's perspective. All right, her son-in-law has just abandoned her daughter for life on the road with a rogue preacher. He had a decent income and a steady job, and he gave that up to be a roadie. Well, in this moment, everything has just changed. Certainly, the narrative surrounding Peter and who he's following has just changed in this household. But on a more serious note, this is a very up-close and personal miracle for the disciples, for these first disciples. And they're moved by this. How do I know this? Because verse 32 through 34 says they go out and they start rounding up all the hurting and the sick people in their hometown, and they bring them to Jesus, who ultimately heals them throughout the night, in fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4. That's what Matthew highlighted, at least. Now, frankly, I believe this is something that every single one of you would have done too. I mean, think about it. Hopefully YouTube doesn't flag me for this, but you would be like, man, Jesus heals people. Let's go get everybody that potentially could get COVID or has COVID, and let's bring them to Jesus, and let's end this pandemic right now. Am I right? You'd be going out in the streets. You'd be going all throughout Port Lambton. You'd be making sure everybody knows there is healing, and Jesus is their healer. Right? You would be fired up by this. You'd be spreading word, no matter where it is, no matter who it is, no matter how embarrassing it might be to knock on the door. You'd be telling them, there's healing because Jesus is here. But friends, are we as excited about the eternal, the internal healing that Jesus offers? I mean, we ought to be. The temporary healing in this moment wasn't the main point of his ministry. These are acts of compassion that lent credibility to his words, the words of life, the words that would bring eternal healing. Sadly, you see throughout reading the Gospels that people kind of like to follow Jesus around, not for the eternal healing, but for the temporary healing. Not for the eternal kingdom, but for the temporary kingdom. Which leads me to ask, what do you want? What are you seeking from Jesus? And if you know about his eternal healing, then are you telling everybody in your hometown? Let's keep going with the text. We find another thing about Jesus. Jesus isn't just a teacher. Jesus just isn't a healer. Jesus is this traveling preacher. All right, let's check it out. Verses 35 through 39. We see starting in verse 35 that Jesus is going to start off his next move by spending time alone with his Father. Now, this is the backbone of any gospel minister's life. Indeed, the fuel that makes the engine run. It was that for Jesus Christ. This leads me to a question. If Jesus needed this time, do you? If Jesus needed to get away and spend time with the Father, what does that mean for you and me? The next thing you see in verse 36 through 37 is that Peter is on the lookout. And in this looking for Jesus, he shows us the priorities that are so common to you and to me. You see, Peter, as the host, is panicked. All right? Everybody's looking to Peter because the man is missing. The man of the hour, the healer, isn't there. And the people are all there. Meaning that Peter is now in a panic. He's like, where is Jesus? And everyone starts to look for Jesus, the one who's going to heal all these people who are at the door of Peter's mother-in-law's place. And Peter's looking around and he finds Jesus. He's like, where have you been? Everyone is looking for you. Now just put yourself there in Peter's shoes. I mean, he's got a tremendous amount on his shoulders. Everyone's looking to him. And these people are loaded with legitimate and immediate needs. By any human standard, this project that is screaming in Peter's ears is a good project. And the need is great. The issues are pressing. The numbers are present. The loudest problems are clearly calling here. So this ought to be a no-brainer, right? Jesus ought to be going with Peter, right? No. Jesus leaves. Jesus doesn't go back. Jesus leaves. Now here's where we all think we know what Jesus ought to do, right? And surely Jesus needs to go back and help all of these people. In your life, surely Jesus needs to fill in the blank. Do this good thing. Surely Jesus needs to do this if he's good, right? But Jesus doesn't fill in the blank all the time. Jesus doesn't go minister to these people. Instead, Jesus seems to have a different priority list altogether. Ultimately, he's been talking with the Father and he has another direction. Now, this is shocking information. It was to me. It's hugely important to me. But Jesus trusts his Father and changes his direction. So then, Christian, let me ask you, as this text asks me, how do you determine your best yes? I mean, how do you determine between your priorities and what his priorities are? Is it always for you the obvious good or the pressing fire or the thing that's shouting the loudest? Or does your daily time hearing from God bring clarity to what your priorities are for that day? Perhaps it's true, and I think it is, that many of us are exhausted chasing after good things. But we're doing so at the expense of God's best things. Often we're altogether too busy to hear from God and to do the best things that God has in mind for us. Let's get back into the text. We see a third observation here. A really important one. In verses 38 through 39, we see that Jesus' main call is to preach. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up, I thought of him as the healer, miracle worker, but the main call here of his ministry is to preach. In fact, this is why he labored. This is why he traveled. I mean, we've already unearthed 50 synagogues to date, and apparently he's going to go to all the synagogues in Galilee. Including, we've also seen and unearthed the synagogue in Capernaum, by the way. And certainly we know that there are way more than 50 synagogues all throughout the area of Galilee. Some, including Josephus, put it at 200 plus synagogues in Galilee. Now, either way that you slice it, that's a whole lot of traveling in order to, or with the purpose of, preaching. This was his main focus. This was his ministry. But there's also something else about this ministry that's evident all throughout the Gospels. See, the Gospel writers are sure to tell us while he's preaching, there are two different types of hearers. There's the crowd, and there's the disciple. The crowd, they show an interest in Jesus. They like the show that he brings, the food that he brings, the experience that he brings, the temporary goods that Jesus gives to them. But then there's the disciple who could hear, who could handle his words, and ultimately would follow him for more. And we see in the recordings that these are the people that Jesus was after. So that leads to a question about us, church. Who will we be? Will we be people that like Jesus for his temporary benefits, for the treats he offers, maybe for the business connections, maybe because I could pray to him and he helps me through difficult situations? Or will we be people that are about his words, that just long to sit at his feet? Will we be the crowd, or will we be his disciples? As we wrap this up, friends, we got to remember, if you've ever wanted to hear Jesus' preaching, you have it in front of you. He is the author of this thing, cover to cover. These words, therefore, are authoritative. These words are packed with his power. These words are ultimately at your disposal in a way that the rest of the world and the rest of Christendom may have drooled over. This is more readily available than maybe it's ever been. It's definitely at your disposal every morning that you wake up. But don't, friends, dispose of these words. Don't let them collect dust. Don't let them rot in your hands or on your lap. Don't think that you have the authority to change it. Instead, just get in it. Be transformed by it. Share it with one another. Live it. And ultimately share it with a world in need of this teacher, of this healer, of the preacher. I hope that you leave this lesson knowing that Jesus is the powerful teacher, healer, and preacher that we all need. And maybe you know him a little more clearly now. Friends, he is the King. And amazingly, he is our friend. I hope that you not only know his good news and his goodness, but now you're inspired a little bit more to pass him on.